Hello, my name is Sage Lavelle. Welcome to another Deaf What interview. Welcome, Paula. She is an Indigenous deaf youth advocate, student, and is involved with many organizations. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to interview with you all. I'm excited. Yes, thank you for joining us. I've seen you be involved so much with the communities, including the deaf and the Indigenous communities. I look forward to learning more about you. I'm happy to express my personal perspective. What I will say does not apply to everyone. It's just an individual perspective. As an Indigenous person, I want to be transparent about the fact that I do not live on the reserve, but live in the city. In saying this, we have different perspectives. I'm part of the Cree tribe, more specifically, the Pasqua First Nations, from the lands in Regina, Saskatchewan, part of Treaty 4. That's where I'm from. I moved here to Ontario. I want to acknowledge the lands here. I, as an Indigenous settler here on this land, which belongs to the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, which are unceded lands. I want to honor these tribes for taking care of the lands, the water, the forest, and the animals. It's so incredibly important to treat each other with respect, to have these exchanges, taking care of each other, working together with other Canadian settlers. I'm grateful. Thank you for sharing. Can you tell us a little bit more about who you are? I'm half Cree, from my mother's side of the family. Soto Cree, which is a different tribe from Plains Cree. Why do I say this? The languages used in these tribes are a bit different. I'm part of Treaty 4, Pasqua First Nation. I wasn't born in the reserve, I was born in a city, Regina. My father's side of the family is French Canadian. I call myself Cree, not Métis. I just wanted to clarify that. The tribes have different cultural practices, and mine is Cree. I moved to Ottawa and grew up here. I was adopted by a family when I was 7 years old. After that, I didn't have much exposure to Indigenous knowledge or culture, even though I knew that I'm Indigenous. I was adopted by a white family. I didn't have that kind of knowledge until I went to college university. Then I learned more about myself and my identity. That was about 4 or 5 years ago. Thank you for sharing. It takes a while to affirm your identity, taking these pieces and incorporating them into your identity. We're always learning about ourselves. Often we disregard our histories, and now we're making these discoveries about who we are. So you're currently a student. What are you studying now? Sure thing. I'm a university student, Indigenous and Canadian Studies. Now I'm a third-year student. I attend university here in Canada, in Ottawa, Carleton University. I really enjoy that program. The interesting thing is that Canadian and Indigenous studies cannot be separate and must be integrated into one program. Some Canadian courses are quite interesting. One may assume that the course is made up of typical Canadian history, but in actuality, there's a lot of Indigenous history, and that's a part of the history of Canada. Now, what are your plans for after graduation? There are so many options. The Indigenous profession itself is more broad. It's also a goal of mine to move to the West because there is a strong Indigenous community there. I want to support Indigenous people there. Many of them are struggling with access. For example, in Saskatchewan, there are a lot of deaf children and most of them are oral. They have barriers to access. I want to elevate them. It's also my home province. It'd be easier because we share the same language and I'd be able to engage with the children. I'm interested in community support positions where I get to engage with people. I also would like to do some research projects, do a documentary, do interviews, etc. That type of documentation work. It's nice to have that data readily available for future generations so they can have better access. Wow, that's a lot of options. I'm really excited for you. I'm looking forward to seeing what you will do in the upcoming future. So what do you want non-Indigenous people to know? I'm curious. There's a lot of issues, a long list, but I'll summarize it up. Again, I must emphasize there are Indigenous people who live on the reserve and Indigenous people who live in the city. Their perspectives are different. It does not mean it's a bad thing, it's actually good. When it comes to information access and privilege, the city people have that. It's not the same on the reserve. We cannot just focus on the city people. The deaf community tends to gather in cities, making it difficult for Indigenous people from reserves to travel and participate. Where's their access? How can their voice be shared? The perspectives are different because of the laws in the cities and reserves. In addition to Indigenous Sign Languages, ISL, there are ongoing conversations about ISL. Recently, Canada recognized Indigenous languages in addition to ASL LSQ. This happened in 2018, which is great. I'm excited about all of the progress. When they added ISL, there were many misconceptions. There are two laws, the Accessible Languages Act, ALA, and the Indigenous Languages Act, ILA. Indigenous languages are part of the ILA, while ISL isn't part of the ALA. Deaf people wanted to add Indigenous Sign Languages into the Accessible Language Act, but we have to wait before acting on it because there isn't a group of deaf Indigenous people readily available to work on this. They cannot represent all of Canada because all tribes have their own language. So far, we have Oneida Sign Language recognized in Ontario. A person from the West cannot represent languages used in Ontario. It's a different tribe. It's not up for discussion. People from the West would not understand this language. There are over 500 spoken Indigenous languages. So when it comes to sign languages, it's the same. There's so many, and it's not interchangeable. It's not all the same. If it's a communication system like International Sign, then people can communicate in that way. It's not an official language shared across tribes. It's not a trained language where we can set up interpretation services for that or develop resources. Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. It's important to reach out to Indigenous people who live on the reserve and in the city. Some don't have internet. That adds to the challenge of considering how to collaborate between people from different environments and the limitations of the internet. It's important to find other ways to engage with people. It may mean going to the reserve in person or using snail mail. We need to be assertive. And the second thing, there are insufficient resources for ISL translation work. There needs to be money invested into recruiting a good number of Indigenous deaf people to work on ISL rather than having a small group of people with a capacity shortage and overwhelming them with this burden. I'm curious, what's your favorite part of being Indigenous? I really love going to powwows. It's so fascinating. You see their cultural attire, it's spiritual. I really enjoy experiencing that as an Indigenous person. I love learning different teachings related to the outdoors and nature. It all makes sense as many of the teachings apply to life. All rocks, water, grass, trees, etc., they all have their own lives and their own rules. These cannot be ignored. It's so interesting. I enjoy reading books like this one titled Braiding Sweetgrass. It's a really good book, so easy to get immersed into. Yes. So I know you're incredibly busy. What do you like to do for fun, to relax? What do you love doing? With being at home due to the coronavirus, it can be exhausting to look at computer screens 9 to 10 hours a day. I take a break and I bead. I made these earrings. You made that? Yes, I did. Wow. So there's a white external circle, then a black circle, then a red dot. Here's a matching necklace to go with the earrings. I bought the necklace and made the matching earrings. It's nice. I like creative projects and beading. I know I'm busy, but I take some time to bead. During classes, I bead while I'm listening. When I'm resting or doing nothing, I bead. There's so many crafts that I want to try, but I don't have the time for it. One thing I like doing is attending events because it's an opportunity for me to learn and listen to their stories. These events give me ideas of how to support deaf Indigenous youth by empowering them, providing space for meetings, workshops, leadership, healing circles, etc. Sometimes I rest, but sometimes my brain just keeps racing. I get that. Many ideas to write down. It's important that you take your own time. You don't have to finish everything now. You have time. Yes, you're right. You have time to achieve your goals. Now you have an Instagram account that focuses on Indigenous information sharing and expression. You want to share more about that? It all started when I volunteered for DYC-JSC, Deaf Youth Canada, as an Indigenous representative. At that time, I didn't have a director position yet. Deaf Youth Canada asked me to share some stories. So I set up an Instagram account so I could share more. I can clarify any questions that people may have. So it's more of an educational account. So my Instagram account is at Big Sky Cree 4. So why that username? Big Sky is the last name of my mother. Cree is my tribe. 4 because I am part of Treaty 4. Feel free to follow my Instagram. When I have time, I'll make some posts. I look forward to seeing your Instagram posts. Of course, some people can post more frequently while others have limited energy because they're already busy with a full plate that needs to become less full. Then y'all can make posts. Whenever you have time to share, I look forward to seeing you. Thank you. So far, you shared some of your thoughts, and I'm curious, what gives you joy? What gives me joy is attending events, listening to elders sharing their stories, especially since they've lived long, good lives. They've seen so much, and it warms my heart. It's so important to acknowledge what gives you joy, that feeling. So do you have any thoughts that you want to share with the hearing world? That's a challenge. I've been telling hearing people that we do have a deaf community. There are many barriers. One is the cost of access. They're the most worried about that. The benefit of having access is to have more effective communication. They're still hesitant about it. Oftentimes, Indigenous nonprofit organizations who get funding cannot afford access. This means they cannot share authentically, which makes it harder. If there's an event online, maybe an interesting workshop via Zoom with interpretation services, I would gather a group of deaf participants and let the organizers know of our presence. As for everyday communication, it's a struggle. There is a group, DIC, Deaf Indigenous Canada, which is under CAD-ASC, and I'm involved with that group. So I will encourage them to attend so they can share their stories. So I hope that hearing people would put in more effort to offer more support. So we have one last question for you. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to share with the deaf community? As I've mentioned before, I think it's important to listen to a wide range of people. When it comes to engaging with the First Nations people, you can ask Métis, Inuit people to be involved. There's not a lot of involvement from those two tribes. Encourage them to be involved, even though the cultural identities are lessening. Don't impose impossible expectations and burden them. Simplify things for them. Allow them to share in their own time. Maybe they feel afraid and prefer to work together in a team, making them feel more comfortable. The Indigenous way is different. There's a lot of group work, collaboration, and support. It's not individualistic or ego-centered. Some people may be that way, and that's fine. It doesn't apply to Indigenous culture. I suggest for deaf people to follow Indigenous figures on social media, like their pages and posts, make a comment, share. Make sure that you're getting the right information. It's so important to make sure it's accurate. Look up different sources and make sure the information is consistent. Again, there are many perspectives. Learn them. It's important not to rely on one Indigenous person, but also learn from a variety of Indigenous people. For example, about 2 or 3 years ago, there were protests against the pipeline being built on traditional Indigenous lands in British Columbia, which was a controversy. However, there were some Indigenous people who supported the pipeline because of the potential economic boom, which is necessary. Today's society is changing and we don't have the same struggles as we had 10 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. We have to adapt to change in order to live in a society. If the economy improves, it's a goal for the First Nations to purchase this land so they would hold the responsibility for the pipeline and the land, not the Canadian government. This way we can support Indigenous people, and this would mean they would use their teachings to improve the community. Again, there are many perspectives. Which do you prefer, a pipeline or a train? How will these construction models affect the environment and the community? The pipeline itself is a challenge because it damages the land, but at the same time, the emissions from the trains are damaging the environment. That's why we need to put things in perspective. Please think about it, learn about different perspectives, and share the information. Again, be open and have conversations with each other in a respectful way. Thank you, Paula, for interviewing with us. Here's a few takeaways from what I've learned through this interview. It's so important to learn different perspectives and to give people space to express themselves, to share, to be listened to. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for interviewing with us for the Deaf What Legacy Project. I also want to recognize the Canada Council of the Arts for funding this project. Thank you so much. I appreciate listening to you. Thank you, Miigwech. Thank you. Cheers.